The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, a charged tension filling the air as people shuffled in their seats. The old wooden benches groaned under the weight of the crowd, most of whom had come to witness what was expected to be a mere formality, a sentencing without evidence, a judgment already made. At the center of it all sat Marcus Reed, a community activist whose name had become synonymous with the fight for justice in their small southern town. His calm demeanor belied the storm raging in his chest. Hands folded neatly on the table before him, Marcus refused to show any sign of the frustration and anger coursing through his veins. He had to remain composed. He always did. Across the room, Judge Robert Klein presided with an air of unshakable authority. His gavel sat idle, but his reputation for swift, often prejudiced decisions loomed like a specter over the proceedings. Klein had made it clear in the past. Men like Marcus were troublemakers, disruptors of the peace he claimed to uphold. Though evidence against Marcus was glaringly absent, the judge's tone during the pre-trial hearings had been laden with insinuations. The room had no doubt how this day would end. Marcus's attorney, a young idealistic woman named Julia Weston, leaned in and whispered, "We'll fight this, Marcus. This isn't the end." But Marcus didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on Judge Klein, as if willing him to feel the weight of every injustice Marcus had fought against. The segregated schools, the police harassment, the countless lives derailed by systemic bias. Behind Marcus, the gallery was packed with supporters, young activists, elders from the church, and everyday folks who had seen enough to know that this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about all of them. Among them sat Esther Reed, Marcus's mother, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was a portrait of quiet resilience, though her eyes betrayed a mother's fear. As the courtroom doors creaked open, a figure slipped in quietly. The man, dressed in a crisp black suit, stood out against the sea of tired, anxious faces. He moved with quiet confidence, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Marcus. The stranger's expression was unreadable, but his presence sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers rose as people speculated about who he might be, a journalist, a lawyer, or something else entirely. Marcus, sensing the shift in the room, glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting the stranger's. The gavel struck. Judge Klein cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Order in the court," he said, his tone firm, dismissive. "Let us proceed." The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that clung to the walls and pressed down on everyone like a weighted blanket. Judge Klein began flipping through papers on his bench, the sound of rustling pages oddly deafening in the stillness. His expression was one of impatience, as though this entire ordeal was an inconvenience to him, a disruption to the natural order he seemed so invested in preserving. Marcus watched the judge carefully, his pulse quickening despite his outward calm. He had faced opposition before, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just another fight for fair housing or school funding. This was a direct attack on his character, his freedom, and the movement he had spent years building. He didn't doubt that Klein intended to make an example of him, to send a clear message to anyone else who dared to challenge the system. Julia Weston stood and began her defense, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Your Honor, the prosecution has presented no credible evidence linking my client to the alleged vandalism. In fact, multiple witnesses have testified to his whereabouts at the time of the incident. This case is baseless and should be dismissed immediately." Klein barely glanced at her. "Mrs. Weston," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "the court has heard your arguments. You may be excused." Julia bristled but held her ground. "Your Honor, I must insist." "Enough," Klein interrupted, his gavel striking the bench with finality. "This court is not here to entertain speeches. Sit down." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by a sharp glare from the bailiff. Marcus's jaw tightened as he felt the familiar sting of humiliation, not for himself, but for the people who had come to believe in him, to trust that he could be their voice. His eyes darted to the stranger in the back of the room. The man's expression remained impassive, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet intensity that made Marcus wonder why he was here. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a smug demeanor, rose next. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew the odds were firmly in his favor. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Reed has a history of inciting unrest in this community. While it may be true that we lack direct evidence in this particular case, his pattern of behavior speaks for itself. This court has the responsibility to ensure that individuals like Mr. Reed are held accountable for the chaos they sow. The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Marcus felt the weight of them, the way they twisted the truth, transforming his years of activism into a caricature of rebellion. He clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to speak out. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, was a weapon his opponents could and would use against him. Julia shot to her feet. "Objection. Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to vilify my client, based on nothing but conjecture and prejudice. This is unacceptable." Judge Klein raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Weston, your objection is noted. Sit down." The gallery stirred again, and this time, the murmurs didn't die down so quickly. Esther Reed turned her gaze toward the stranger in the back of the room. There was something in his posture, a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the rising tension around him. She leaned toward the person next to her and whispered, "Who do you think he is?" The response was a shrug, but Esther couldn't shake the feeling that the man was more than he appeared. Klein cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his ruling. In the absence of direct evidence, this court recognizes the challenge of arriving at a definitive conclusion. However, given Mr. Reed's history of disruption and the seriousness of the charges, I see no reason to delay this matter further. He paused, savoring the moment. "Mr. Reed, you will—" The stranger stood. The movement was so sudden and deliberate that it drew every eye in the room. Even Klein stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in surprise. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing on the wooden floor as he approached the front of the courtroom. He held a briefcase in one hand, his posture upright and commanding. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe this proceeding is missing a critical element: justice." Klein's face flushed red with irritation. "And who, exactly, do you think you are?" The man smiled faintly, setting his briefcase on the defense table beside Marcus. "My name is Malcolm Hart. I represent the Department of Justice." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a stunned silence. Even Julia seemed momentarily lost for words. Marcus turned to the man, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and cautious hope. "Mr. Hart," Klein said, his voice faltering slightly, "I don't recall any notice from the DOJ regarding this case." "That's because my involvement was only recently authorized," Hart replied smoothly. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "I've reviewed the details of this case, and it's clear to me that this trial is not about upholding the law, but about weaponizing it against an innocent man." The tension in the room was palpable as Hart began distributing the documents to the judge and the defense. "This file contains evidence of procedural violations in this trial, including coercion of witnesses and suppression of exculpatory evidence. Furthermore, it highlights a disturbing pattern of racial bias in the rulings from this court." Klein's face darkened, his composure slipping. "I will not tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom," he snapped. "They're not baseless, Your Honor," Hart said, his tone sharp, "and I assure you the DOJ takes such matters very seriously." The gallery erupted in hushed whispers, the weight of Hart's words sinking in. Marcus watched as the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence visibly eroding. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The courtroom was electric, the air thick with anticipation as Malcolm Hart's words lingered. Judge Klein, who had commanded the room with unshakable authority moments ago, now seemed uncharacteristically rattled. His hands gripped the edges of his bench, as if trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. Malcolm Hart stood tall, unflinching under the weight of Klein's glare. His calm demeanor, combined with the undeniable authority of his presence, sent an unspoken message. The rules of this game had just changed. "This is highly irregular," Judge Klein finally sputtered, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt to sound firm. "Mr. Hart, the Department of Justice has no jurisdiction here. This is a local matter." "On the contrary, Your Honor," Hart replied, his tone unwavering. "When civil rights violations are at stake, the Department of Justice has every jurisdiction. This case isn't just about vandalism. It's about a man being prosecuted not for what he's done, but for what he represents." The gallery erupted into murmurs, and even Julia looked at Hart with newfound respect. Marcus, still seated, tried to process what was happening. The stranger's intervention had shifted the dynamics of the trial in a way Marcus hadn't thought possible, but a part of him remained skeptical. Too often, promises of justice had turned out to be illusions. Judge Klein's face hardened. This court will not be disrupted by theatrics. Mr. Hart, unless you have evidence directly relevant to this case, I will ask you to leave. Hart's lips twitched into a faint smile, as if he had been expecting this resistance. Evidence, Your Honor. I'm glad you mentioned that. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out another document, holding it up for the room to see. This is a sworn affidavit from a witness who was intimidated into silence by your prosecution team. They were told that if they testified on Mr. Reed's behalf, their livelihood and their safety would be at risk. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Marcus's heart began to race. Could this really be the turning point? That's a lie, the prosecutor barked, his face red with anger. Is it? Hart shot back, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Because I also have a copy of the subpoena you issued to this witness, which conveniently left out critical details about the so-called evidence you claim to have. It's all here, Your Honor. Clear violations of due process. Judge Klein's face turned a deeper shade of red. He looked as though he wanted to argue, but the weight of Hart's accusations and the murmurs of the crowd left him momentarily speechless. Furthermore, Hart continued, his voice steady but firm, I've reviewed Judge Klein's prior rulings in similar cases. There is a troubling pattern. Minorities are sentenced at disproportionately higher rates and with harsher penalties than their white counterparts. This is not justice, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted again, this time with louder whispers and a few stifled cheers. The bailiff barked for order, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Judge Klein, now visibly flustered, slammed his gavel down repeatedly. Enough! I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. Hart stepped closer to Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. Your Honor, he said, his voice softening but still resolute. This man has dedicated his life to improving this community. He has stood against injustice with nothing but his principles and his courage, and now he's being punished for it. But today, I am here to ensure that justice prevails. The gallery fell silent, hanging on Hart's every word. Even Esther, who had been quietly clutching her hands, allowed a tear to slip down her cheek. For the first time since this ordeal began, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. Klein stared at Hart, his jaw tight. The power dynamics of the room had shifted completely, and for the first time, the judge seemed unsure of what to do. His usual tools of intimidation and dismissal had failed him, and now the weight of his decisions, and their consequences, hung over him like a storm cloud. Mr. Hart, he said finally, his voice low, I will review your documents, but understand this. No one walks into my courtroom and dictates how I should conduct my proceedings. That's all I ask, Your Honor, Hart replied, his tone calm but unyielding. As Hart returned to his seat, Marcus looked at him, his voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Hart met his gaze, his expression softening. Because justice doesn't need familiarity. It just needs someone willing to fight for it. Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that the fight wasn't his alone, but he still felt the pressure of his own failing. The hours dragged on as the court broke for recess to review the evidence Malcolm Hart had presented. The crowd in the gallery buzzed with speculation while Marcus sat quietly, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. He had spent years building a movement, fighting battles where victories were rare, and now his fate lay in the hands of a stranger, a man who, despite his confidence, was still an unknown variable. Esther Reed approached her son during the break, her hands trembling as she reached for his. Marcus, she said softly, her voice filled with equal parts fear and pride. Whatever happens in there, you've already won. You've shown them who you are. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, nodding. I hope you're right, Mama, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When court resumed, the atmosphere was taut with tension. Judge Klein returned to his bench, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. He cleared his throat, signaling the room to quiet down. The gallery hushed, and all eyes turned to him. I have reviewed the materials presented by Mr. Hart, Klein began, his voice measured but tight. While I find some of the claims troubling, this court is not in the habit of allowing outsiders to dictate its rulings. Hart rose to his feet. Your Honor, with respect, this is not about dictating your rulings. It's about ensuring they are just. If the court ignores evidence of bias and procedural misconduct, it undermines the very foundation of our legal system. Klein glared at him, but before he could respond, Julia Weston stood. Your Honor, I'd like to formally request that this case be dismissed based on the new evidence. Continuing this trial under these circumstances would be a gross miscarriage of justice. The prosecutor, red-faced and visibly flustered, shot to his feet. This is absurd. We can't let the defense derail this case with baseless accusations and theatrics. Hart turned to face the prosecutor, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a knife. Baseless. Are you denying the evidence of witness intimidation, the suppressed documents? Or perhaps you're suggesting the DOJ fabricated all of it? The prosecutor faltered, his words catching in his throat. Klein raised a hand, silencing the room. Enough. This is my courtroom, and I will not have it turned into a spectacle. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Mr. Hart, Ms. Weston, while your arguments are compelling, I am not inclined to dismiss this case outright. However, he hesitated, as if the next words were a bitter pill to swallow. I will allow further investigation into the claims of misconduct. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks to determine the validity of these accusations. The gallery erupted, voices rising in disbelief and relief in equal measure. While it wasn't the outright dismissal Marcus and his team had hoped for, it was a significant step forward, one that had seemed impossible just hours ago. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Marcus turned to Hart. Thank you, he said, his voice earnest. I don't know how you pulled this off, but thank you. Hart offered a small smile. This isn't over yet, Marcus. The fight for justice rarely is, but you've got a lot of people behind you, don't forget that. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was greeted by a crowd of supporters who had gathered during the trial. They erupted into cheers as he stepped into the sunlight, chanting his name and waving signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "Equality Now." Julia leaned over and whispered, "You've inspired them, Marcus. This is what you've been fighting for." He nodded, taking a deep breath as he stepped toward the crowd. For the first time in days, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The DOJ's investigation unearthed more damning evidence against the prosecution and Judge Klein's courtroom practices. Witnesses who had initially stayed silent began to come forward, emboldened by Hart's intervention. When the court reconvened, the gallery was even more packed than before. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of momentum, a feeling that the tide was turning. Judge Klein, his face pale and drawn, entered the courtroom with none of his usual bluster. He seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by the scrutiny he now faced. As the proceedings began, Hart presented the findings of the investigation, laying out a compelling case for systemic bias and misconduct. The evidence was undeniable, and even the prosecutor seemed to have lost his confidence. By the time Julia delivered her closing argument, the courtroom was silent, the weight of the truth hanging heavily over everyone. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady and clear, this case has never been about vandalism. It's been about silencing a man who dared to challenge the status quo. But Marcus Reed is not just a man. He is a voice for this community, and this community deserves justice. I urge this court to dismiss these charges and restore faith in our legal system. When Judge Klein finally spoke, his voice was subdued. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the arguments presented, this court has no choice but to dismiss all charges against Mr. Reed. The room erupted into applause, the gallery rising to its feet in celebration. Marcus felt a rush of relief and gratitude as Julia hugged him tightly. Esther, tears streaming down her face, stood and clapped along with the crowd. As Marcus stepped outside to address the waiting crowd, he spotted Malcolm Hart standing off to the side, his arms crossed and a faint smile on his lips. Marcus walked over, extending a hand. You didn't just help me today, he said. You helped all of us. Hart shook his hand firmly. Justice is a team effort, Marcus. Keep fighting the good fight. With that, Hart turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. Marcus watched him go, a sense of determination rising within him. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. As Marcus stood before the jubilant crowd, their cheers echoing across the courthouse steps, a familiar voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Don't get too comfortable, Reed. This isn't over." Marcus turned to see Prosecutor Daniels stepping out of the courthouse, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. Though the charges had been dismissed, Daniels's defeat had only stoked the fire of his vendetta. The crowd's cheers quieted as Daniels approached, the tension palpable. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You might have won today, but people like you don't win in the long run. I'll make sure of that." Marcus took a step forward, his posture firm but composed. "People like me?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Daniels smirked, the condescension dripping from his tone. "Yes, people who think they can disrupt this system and walk away unscathed. The law doesn't protect agitators, Reed. You're still on borrowed time." The crowd began murmuring angrily, their protective instincts for Marcus flaring up, but he held up a hand, signaling for them to stay back. "You know what your problem is, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice steady. "You think power is about control, about keeping people in their place. But real power? It's about lifting people up. And that's something you'll never understand." Daniels's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Before he could retort, another voice interrupted. "You've already lost, Daniels," Malcolm Hart said, stepping forward from the crowd. His sudden reappearance sent a ripple of energy through the gathered supporters. "You just don't know it yet." Daniels turned to face Hart, his bravado quickly replaced by defensiveness. "What are you still doing here?" he snapped. Hart smiled faintly. "Making sure justice doesn't end at the courtroom door." He gestured to the crowd. "Look around you. These people aren't afraid anymore. That's what scares you, isn't it? That you're losing control." Daniels's face twisted with anger. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Hart. Stick to your federal cases and leave this town alone." But Hart didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't about jurisdiction. It's about accountability. And trust me, Daniels, we're just getting started. The DOJ will be looking into every case you've touched, every corner of your career. If there's rot, we'll find it." The tension between the two men was electric, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Daniels glanced around, his confidence wavering under the weight of the eyes watching him. "This isn't over," Daniels growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Hart replied, his tone razor-sharp. "It's just beginning." Daniels turned and stalked away, his retreat met with a mixture of cheers and jeers from the crowd. Marcus watched him go, his chest tight with a mix of relief and unease. Hart turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "Bullies like him thrive on fear," he said. "But you've shown this community that they don't have to be afraid anymore. That's real power, Marcus. Don't let it go." "But would—" Marcus nodded, the weight of Hart's words settling over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Hart clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep fighting." With that, Hart disappeared into the crowd once more, leaving Marcus to face his supporters. As he stepped up to the makeshift podium, the cheers swelled again, and he took a deep breath. "This isn't just my victory," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is ours. Today we proved that no one is above accountability, that the truth matters, no matter how hard they try to bury it. And this is just the beginning. Together, we'll keep fighting until justice isn't just a word. It's a reality." "Yes!" The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a symphony of hope and determination. Marcus stood tall, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Daniels's threats lingered in his mind, but they no longer held the same power. He wasn't alone in this fight, and for the first time in a long time, he believed that change was truly possible. As the courthouse faded into the background and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found a quiet moment to himself. The evening sky stretched overhead, painted in hues of orange and deep blue, a tranquil contrast to the turmoil that had defined the past weeks. He stood on the steps, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, lost in thought. The victory was undeniable, but it came with a heavy dose of reality. This fight, like so many others he had waged, was far from over. Daniels's threats lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. Yet for the first time, Marcus didn't feel the weight of those challenges pressing down on him alone. His mother's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You did good today," Esther said, standing beside him. Her eyes glistened with pride, though her face bore the weariness of a mother who had worried far too much for far too long. "I couldn't have done it without everyone," Marcus replied, his voice soft. He looked at her, the gratitude evident in his expression. "And without you." Esther smiled, reaching out to touch his face gently. "You've always been a fighter, Marcus. But today you showed them that your fight isn't just for yourself. It's for all of us. That's what makes you special." Her words settled deep within him, resonating like an unspoken truth he had always known but never fully embraced. He nodded, the emotions welling up but held back by a quiet determination. As the evening deepened, Julia Weston joined them, her professional demeanor softening as she approached. "You know," she began, "I've worked on a lot of cases, but this one felt different. You reminded all of us why this fight matters." Marcus offered her a small smile. "I just hope it's enough to make a difference." Julia shook her head firmly. "It already has." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day giving way to a quiet sense of accomplishment. As Marcus finally descended the courthouse steps, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would be many. But he wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago. This wasn't the end of his story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the fight for justice would no longer be his alone. Marcus Reed wasn't just a man fighting for himself, he had become a symbol of hope for a community, a voice for the silenced, and a reminder that justice, though slow, was always worth pursuing. With each step he took into the night, he carried not just his own resolve, but the collective strength of everyone who had stood by him, and for the first time, the darkness ahead didn't feel so daunting.